results of some research we've been working on for the last few years with regard to pureed food. And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that there have been a number of people involved with this. Heather, who has just left the room, has been quite involved with this research from the very beginning, and there were a couple of students whose results I'm going to show today, Neela Ilhamto and Laura Littinger, and they were instrumental in making this possible. So, sorry, I'm just trying to get used to the microphone here. We also had funding for this research from OMAFRA and as well as from the Canadian Agricultural Adaptation Program, and Hillary was instrumental in helping us to get that. So, pureed foods are a form of modified texture food. And from a food science perspective, we define pureed foods as a suspension or dispersion of solids and liquids. So basically what we're doing is we're taking a food and we're putting it into a food processor of some description. And from our research, we know that everybody uses the same food processor. It's a RoboCoupe that everybody uses. You puree it to a fine particle size by adding some liquid to help lubricate it and make it smooth. And this type of food is commonly consumed by people with dysphagia. It's not the only kind of modified texture food that's available, but it's probably the poorest studied, which is why we wanted to take a look at it, because there's not a great deal of research out there looking at pureed food. Now, from a statistics perspective, somewhere between 15 and 26% of long-term care residents could be on a pureed food. It's somewhat of a moving statistic because sometimes people are on pureed food for a period of time, and when they can start eating normal texture food, they go back onto normal texture food. So it's a bit of a moving target in terms of who is actually on pureed food. We know that you can get pureed foods from a number of different sources. They can be sourced commercially from a number of different companies that are in Ontario and in the Toronto area, and I've listed them here, and later on you can try Marzan's Foods examples. They've got some examples to try, and they're working on them right now, so you can all look forward to those later on. And we can also have in-house pureed food being produced, and we know that most people are producing in-house for a number of different reasons, which I'll show you on the next slide. And basically they're taking their recipes and they're using them to develop pureed food. And also, just to let you know, the work that I'm going to show you today did have some help from a number of the commercial companies with donation of food. And one of them was Campbell Canada, who was responsible for providing some of the food for lunch today. So why do people puree foods in-house rather than buying commercial products? There are a number of different reasons why they do that, and some of them are quite practical. One being the cost of the food. At the time we did the research, daily food costs were $7.33 per resident per day, and so people found that there just wasn't enough money to be buying commercial food products for people that needed it. They also found that from a practical perspective, they didn't have room in their freezers to put the boxes of pureed foods that they may be getting from commercial companies. So purely a storage perspective was one thing that people needed to consider. And lastly, they found that it was easier to match pureed food to normal textured foods if they made it themselves, because they would just take some of the food that they had cooked for the normal textured meals and they would just puree it. So it was easy for them to do that rather than buying commercial products. They also felt that it was more fresh and less like a restaurant meal if it was pureed in-house, and that they could control the quality in terms of the taste and nutrition as well as the ingredients that were used. And that was a big part of how they were trying to maintain the quality of the food. By doing it themselves and making it in-house, they felt that it was a nicer product for their residents, and most of the people that we interviewed with regard to this research were very concerned about the residents having something that was good and something that they liked. We do know that there are some problems with pureed food no matter where you get your pureed food from. One is that there's reduced sensory acceptability, which makes sense when you think about the fact that you're taking something that you would normally eat with quite a nice texture. If we think about a carrot, and you're going to see a lot of carrot pictures in a few minutes, a carrot has a nice crunch. If you puree it, there is no crunch left. It's basically just well, it's got a texture, but it's not crunch. I was trying to think of a good term for it, but there is no good term for it when it's been pureed. So there's going to be reduced sensory acceptability because you remove some of the cues that people use to decide if they like a food product. We also know that there is maybe a reduction in the nutrient density because when you start pureeing your foods and you're adding liquids to it, you may see that you've reduced the nutritional quality of the food. So you have to be a little careful with that and just ensure that you're not compromising on the nutrients in the food product by adding liquids that are not actually providing any sort of nutrition. And one of the big problems within Canada is we have no standardized guidelines. So everybody follows a different set of rules when they make their food products. And it's usually something that they've established in-house that they feel are appropriate in terms of guidelines. And they range from people looking at pictures that have been posted on the walls in the kitchens to know what is an appropriate texture, sticking a fork or a spoon in the food to see what it looks like. Very few of them actually tasted it. So not a lot of people put the food in their mouth and tried to see what it felt like in their mouth. So without standardized guidelines, everybody's using a different approach to decide what's an appropriate texture. And that's a really big problem because the goal with pureed foods really is to maximize your food intake while you're minimizing choking and aspiration. You don't want people to be choking on the food, so you have to make sure that the texture is a good texture. And so without standardized guidelines, it's really difficult to know that you've hit that right texture. So what we did is we took a look at the sensory properties of the food, and this is what I do. I'm a sensory evaluation person, so I feed people food and ask them what they think of it. And we did it in two ways. We took a bunch of different types of pureed food products and we asked them, or we gave them to a trained panel and we asked the trained panel to evaluate them. So a trained panel, just to give you a little lecture on sensory evaluation, it is where you take a small group of people, usually about 10, and you train them to be very highly analytical with regard to eating the food product. So these are people that are not typical consumers. They're people who are very analytical and they like to dissect their food. And they characterize the food based on whatever sensory attributes that they found were important in the food. And it could be texture, and there were some texture terms that they came up with the pureed food, even though it wasn't the normal texture of the food. It could be taste, it could be odors, it could be appearance. And all of the attributes were evaluated on a 15-centimeter line for intensity. So we weren't interested in liking, we were interested in knowing what the perceived sensory properties of the foods were. So I'm going to start with some commercial products. So what we have here are 4 commercial products that we were evaluating. And you can see that they're all quite different in terms of their appearance. We have a product that looks a little less orange and somewhat dry, up to something that is a round disc and looks quite wet. And what we did is we plotted the responses with regard to the intensities of the sensory properties on what we call a spider plot. So how you interpret this is 0 means low intensity, the higher out means higher intensity, and these are all the sensory attributes of the food products. So we evaluated the color intensity, the aroma of carrots, the thickness, the earthy green, sweet, bitter, and aftertaste. And these are all attributes that people felt were very important in these carrots. And what you see is basically we have 4 distinctly different products there. So every product was slightly different in what they looked like. C1, which is the blue line, was perceived to be quite thick and low in color intensity, and also was picked up as a green note. So those of you who don't know green, it's grass. So in order to train people to evaluate this characteristic, we just went and cut some grass and fed it to, well, we didn't feed it to people, they smelled it. And so that's how they picked up the grassy, or the green grassy note in the carrot. If you take a look at turkey, you can see again they're quite different in terms of what they look like. And so again, T1 is quite light, T4 is beige, and T3 looks like it's quite runny by comparison to all the other products. And when we took a look at their sensory attributes, the panel was able to come up with a lot of different attributes in comparison to the carrot. Again, we have the color. We have some aromatics, and you'll see that there's a chicken fat aroma in there because some of these products did smell like chicken fat. So I think the liquid they were using was probably some sort of chicken broth. We also had a peppery note, salt, umami, which is a taste. It's the taste of MS cheese, so it's a savory, brothy note. Then we had turkey flavor, chicken fat flavor, thickness, mouth coating, and aftertaste. And again, you can see the products are quite different, which means that when you're sourcing your products from a commercial source, you kind of need to know what the sensory properties are so you can pick something that people are going to like, because they are quite different. Now, the last product we evaluated was bread. We had two very, very, very different breads. One that was like turkey stuffing and had sage and some pepper in it, and one that looked like mashed potatoes. And I think it had potatoes in it, which is probably why it looked a bit like mashed potatoes. And when you look at these, you can see that they were opposite in almost all of their sensory attributes, where one had an onion sage aroma, and one was adhesive, soft, and smooth. So you can see that they were very, very different in their sensory properties. And again, it just shows you how variable these products can be. But because a lot of people are pureeing their own products in-house, we wanted to take a look and see what you could do if you wanted to modify your sensory properties of your products in-house. So what we did is we started to make our own pureed turkey, and we looked at the amount of liquid because we wanted to know how much adding different amounts of liquid affected the sensory properties of the turkey. And what we found is that you need to add somewhere between 40% and 45% weight per weight liquid in order to get a product that could be consumed safely. And we didn't really have a good gauge for safety because there are no guidelines, so we just took the commercial products and gauged our puree thickness against the commercial product thickness. And you can see that with the lower liquid, you get a thicker product, but many of the other sensory properties don't change. So adding more liquid doesn't really change the sensory properties, it changes the thickness of the product. If we take a look at what happens when you puree thigh and breast meat versus just plain breast meat, you need to have about a 60%, 40% breast to thigh ratio in order to get something comparable to 100% breast meat. You can't puree, anybody tried to puree just thigh meat and dark meat, it's like sand. So it's really gritty and really sandy. So you actually need to put some breast meat in there. And if you want something that's comparable to just a plain white meat, a 60-40 breast to thigh ratio will give that, and you don't see any differences in the sensory properties of the products. And lastly, what we did is we looked at when you add your spices. So the student, Mila, that was working on this project had found a paper that said that pepper triggers swallowing. And so if you can add pepper into your products, then maybe you can help people to swallow more safely and in a better fashion. So she looked at whether you needed to rub your meat before it went into the oven with your spice blend. So take your spice blend and add it onto the surface of the meat before you cook it, or do you add it during the puree process? And what she found changed within the two different products was actually the peppery flavor. So if you add the spice blend to the product prior to cooking, you get a stronger pepper flavor than if you add it during the puree process. It also altered the thickness slightly, but those were the only two sensory properties that really changed. So if you wanted to give your product a bit more of a peppery note because you think it might help swallowing, then putting the spice blend on the meat before you cook might help with that. Now, what we also did is looked at carrots, where we actually added different types of thickeners because we were interested in seeing if we could improve the nutritional quality of these carrots. So C is the control, MT is modified thickener, which is what people are typically using in a kitchen. When Mila went and interviewed people in kitchens, what she found was that MT, the modified thickener, was what everybody was using. But then she also looked at rice cereal and skim milk powder to see whether we could improve the nutrition but still maintain the sensory properties of the food. And what you can see is that the modified thickener actually has the biggest differences in the sensory properties. The texture of the modified thickener products, which is this line right here was quite different in comparison to all of the other products. It gives it a shinier look, and it changes what the products look like. The skim milk powder and the rice cereal really didn't change things very much in comparison to the control. So if you're concerned about the visual appearance of your products, you need to take a look at what thickener you're adding, because it can change the visual appearance. But the big question is, how much do people like it? Because that's what we want to know, is what's driving liking. So what we did is we asked some consumers of pureed products to indicate their liking on a 5-point scale, where 1 was very bad and 5 was very good. And we added a smiley face scale in there just in case the people we were studying were having a hard time understanding the words. So if they couldn't understand the words, then all they had to do was point to a face. And that was how we got the responses from them. And we know that appearance is really important for pureed foods, that people decide by looking at the product whether they're going to like the product. So we asked liking of appearance and liking of flavor. And when we look at a comparison of the liking scores between in-house and commercial pureed carrots, what you can see is the liking scores sit around 3, so they're okay, and they're not different. So our in-house purees were liked similarly to the commercial products for both appearance and for flavor. If we take a look at the commercial products alone and we take a closer look at the liking of the carrot flavor, you can see that the products do differ in liking, and that there's a big spread in terms of liking, where some people really don't like the products and some people really like the products. So you can see there's some individuality with regard to liking of the products. The turkey is the same. You can see that again there's a spread where some people really liked TP1, but we can see that TP1 was also considered to be very bad. So there's a big spread, which shows you that everybody likes different things in their food products. So what we did is we correlated our liking scores to our trained panel scores so that we could see what attributes in the food products were most liked. And what's driving liking of the products. So when we take a look at the carrots, you can see that people like a higher color intensity. So they like something that's stronger in orange if they're going to be consuming a carrot. So there's a positive relationship between liking of color intensity and liking of appearance and the color intensity of the carrots. With regard to the turkey, we see that there's a negative correlation with the turkey and chicken fat aroma and liking of appearance, which means that people didn't like the appearance of the products that had a lower turkey and chicken fat aroma. This is a somewhat odd association, and it may just be totally just an artifact of the study, or it could be that they know something we don't know and they're able to use aroma to help dictate appearance of the product. And lastly, with carrots, people want sweet carrots. So with your pureed products, sweeter is better than not sweet. There's a significant correlation between sweetness and liking of flavor. And that's not surprising because we know that tastes don't change that much with aging, odors do, so that sweet taste is what people are picking up. So what can you do in the kitchen if you want to design pureed products that people are going to like? Well, there's a number of things you can do. From a practicality perspective, to make it easy to prepare the foods, we interviewed cooks and they gave us some suggestions. The first one is how you puree your food. So mincing your foods first at low speed and then taking out some of the mince and then finishing it off helps maintain the integrity of your food processor. So you don't have to replace it as often because it seems to be easier on the food processor. And also, from an ease of preparation point of view, is pureeing the foods when they're hot, not when they're cold, because that seems to help break the food down easier. Now, from an appearance perspective, offering people a lot of color variety is a good thing. But what you have to make sure you don't do is mix all your colors together, because mixing your colors together is not a way to impress your consumers. So don't take your sandwich and stick it in the food processor all at the same time. Puree each bit individually and then reassemble it back on the plate, because people don't want all of their foods mixed together because it mixes all of the colors together and it doesn't make a very appealing meal. And to maintain flavor, if you can process your foods as close to point of service as possible, that's a good thing. Because what you're doing when you're processing your food is you're releasing all those flavor volatiles. It's exactly the same thing you do when you chew your food. As you're chewing your food, you're releasing flavor volatiles. So this food has just had the flavor volatiles released sooner while it's being processed. And so when those flavor volatiles disappear, they're not going to hit the person's mouth. They're not going to be able to be detected. So processing close to point of service is a really good thing to do. And enhancing the flavor by using different types of seasonings is also a really powerful suggestion. So using something that contributes to the flavor of the food. So using turkey broth if you're pureeing turkey, or adding something into your pureed vegetables to help enhance some of that flavor is a really good thing to do. And lastly, garnishing the food to help people identify what the food is a very, very good suggestion, because when you think about it, if you're eating a meal of pureed turkey or chicken, pureed potatoes and pureed cauliflower, how are you going to know? It's going to be quite a challenge to figure out what it is that people are consuming. So adding some garnishes to help identify the foods will help with that. But what you have to remember when you put your garnishes on the plate is make sure they're pureed as well, because if you don't puree it, then people can't eat it. So adding different types of garnishes to the food, there are a number of different suggestions here of things that you can do. So just in summary, it is possible to develop acceptable pureed food and from a sensory perspective. And that's what this research has been all about. And so what is really important is to think about what it looks like and what kind of flavors are being perceived. And so flavor enhancement may possibly be necessary. And like the last slide showed, garnishing is a really good thing to do. But mostly, most importantly, I would say talk to your consumers. Find out what they like and find out what they don't like, because that's going to have a significant impact on whether they eat the food or they don't eat the food.